Hello students, welcome to Lab 6, our final lab. There is no homework associated with this lab, and instead we're just going to be looking at cool stuff. That's it. Some stuff that we covered in the lecture, for example, we're going to briefly go over how to apply correlation and linear models that we looked at in the lecture. But besides that, we're just going to look at kind of some of the cool stuff that you can do in R Markdown. You don't have to use any of this stuff for your final paper, but I expect that some of you will. It's pretty neat. For example, we're going to start off with correlation and linear models, which are all very useful, especially correlation. If you don't use linear models in your final paper, I won't be upset or offended. If you don't need to, don't use a more complicated tool than you need, right? If you do your whole paper just showing me summary statistics and nice visualizations, I'm happy with that. But if you want to use linear models, you will learn how to do that in today's lab. After that, we're going to go and create some interactive visualizations. So you may have noticed in our last module and our last lab that we were knitting to an HTML document. And you might think to yourself, well, wait a minute, I know that my browser is fully capable of doing all sorts of neato and nifty things. I would love it if my charts did some neato and nifty things. Things like when I hover over a bar or a line, I want all the other bars or lines to fade out so that my data is highlighted, the one that the user is looking at. So we're going to do a little bit of that. We'll just get into the very, very basics of it to show you, and then you can play around with it as you please for your paper. And then finally, we're going to go over the very, very basics of maps. We use a map in more depth in Module 8, and since Modules 7 and 8 are kind of case studies to show you how to apply the stuff that you're learning and how it might be used in practice, either in industry, in an actual election campaign, or in academic research. But today I want to whet your appetite a little bit and show you how things like maps are created in R. And we're going to do all of this in the context of R Markdown. So we're basically just going to create another report in this lab, and that should hopefully show you kind of what the workflow looks like for your final report. Again, there's no assignment associated with this lab, so instead I really want to give you plenty of time to work on your final paper, but with this lab hopefully you get a little bit more practice using the tools that you'll need to make a nice paper. So why don't we get started? Let us open a new file in R Markdown. We can call it lab 6. That is me, that is today, and we're going to do this with HTML. Okie doke. Now, you can configure R and R Markdown so that it doesn't produce all of this kind of sample text every single time. Lab 6 Markdown. But it doesn't really bother me, so every time I open it, I just delete it. I'm not writing so many documents to where it takes up that much time. So why don't I get started by changing some of these headers and adding a few to the topics we're going to discuss today. So the first one is correlation and linear models. I know the second one is going to be interactive charts. And I know the third one is going to be maps. So why don't I go ahead and knit that, make sure it's working. Never a bad idea to test your code in the early stages. Just make sure that at every step of the way it's working. Knitting right now takes no time at all. So yep. Okay, everything looks good. Why don't we also go ahead and call the libraries we've been using all semester so far, like dplyr, like like ggplot2, and like tidyr, which has a lot of those pivoting things. Note that I don't actually have to run this code right now, because every time I knit this document, it's going to start a new R instance and then call them, right? This is useful for other reasons, but let's just go ahead and put that there. Also, remember last module when I said that it's often useful to have a script open, just a regular script, not a markdown script. Whenever you're writing a markdown document, it's useful to have a script open so you can test your scripts before you put them into a chunk, because it's actually a little bit difficult to debug things in chunks in a markdown document. It's much easier to debug them when you have a script in the same directory and you can make sure everything works before you put it into a chunk. So why don't we go ahead and read in our data. It's data.csv and look at the top few rows. Okay, so we're looking at the same data set that we used for our lecture. So we know we're probably going to have to do a few things just like we did last time. I'm going to get rid of that first column X that has the row index, and I also know that we did some things like we tamed our GDP per capita variable, so why don't we do that again here? We can mutate our GDP per capita by taking the log base 10 of GDP per capita. Note that I'm just overriding the current variable. So when I do this, if I had named it something like this, you'll see that I created a new column, but I don't actually want that this time around. So I'm just going to override the current GDP per capita column with my new calculated version and write no new column this time. New column last time because there's a new name, same name, no new column. Great. So the rest of these values look pretty much good. I know that they're all, either counts or percentages, so I don't really feel the need to log base 10 any of them. But I do know from our lecture that electricity and malaria, the variation really isn't continuous. Really, the interesting variation happens between countries with some cases of malaria and those with none, so binary, and likewise with electricity, countries with full access to electricity and those with none. So why don't I turn those into a binary variable? So I'm going to say electricity if else electricity equals 100. That is, if it's a country with 100% access to electricity, I'm going to say 0. Otherwise 1. And 1 here means not full access to electricity. Why would I do that? Surely 0 would better be associated with countries that don't have full access to electricity. But in fact, what I want 0 to represent is my modal value. And that's for a reason. Because when I fit my linear model, I want to be able to interpret the intercept as the most average country. And most countries, the modal country has full access to electricity. So that's why we do this coding this way, right? And let's run that and let's see. Okay, we got our binary variable. Terrific. That's what we wanted. And for malaria, it's kind of the opposite, isn't it? So I'll say if else malaria equals 0, most countries don't have any cases of malaria, then 0, otherwise 1. So I kind of had to do the opposite, right? And sure enough, that worked out. Now, I also know that I still have these 3 continuous variables, infant mortality, female representation, and GDP per capita. And I want to center and standardize those variables. So luckily, R has a function that does that for me. I don't have to go through and then manually type in, minus mean divided by standard deviation. Scale does that for me, right? But one important thing to know about scale is, actually, why don't we just do this right now? Why don't we take a look at scale? Let's read in data here for a second. CSV, data.csv. Okay, so this is the original data set. Again, we haven't saved this one to anything yet, so we're just looking at this one right now, just totally raw. Let's go ahead and let's see what the output of scale looks like for female representation in Parliament. Okay, we have our normal numbers, but then we also have these attributes. And if I append these to the end of my data set, they're not going to play nice. with the rest of my data. So what I want to do is I just want to keep this numeric part, and I don't care about these attributes. So I'm going to put as numeric, and sure enough, I get my values that I want here, right? Without these things. These are important if I need to unscale or reverse this operation, but for now, I'm not too interested in that. So let's go ahead, let's go back to this. So we know what we need to do. We need to add as numeric. Once we do that, let's remove data for now from those objects so we don't get confused. And let's go ahead and scale first infant mortality equals scale infant mortality, and then we're just going to keep the as numeric, right? Okay. We're going to do the same thing for female, oh my gosh, representation equals scale female representation, and that needs to be as numeric. And then lastly, we're going to do the same thing for GDP per capita equals scale GDP per capita. Once again, as numeric. Let's go ahead and take a look, and yeah, those look like much more well-behaved variables than the ones that we started with. So why don't we go ahead and we can delete this head part, and we can now put this code into our chunk, our setup chunk. And let's run that, make sure that we're good. Yep, works perfectly. Okay, so why don't we start off by doing the correlation argument. And in fact, since we've loaded this, why don't we test our correlation code here first. And the function for correlation is COR. And I want to correlate two variables, infant mortality with GDP per capita. Let's see what we get when we run that. Now, what's likely happening is that since we have NA values, core doesn't really know what to do about that. So why don't we pull up the documentation for core, and we'll see what we get. Here's core. Use, that seems useful. Why don't we go down to use, an optional character string giving a method for computing covariances in the presence of missing values. Yep, that's what we're looking for. This must be one of the strings. Okay, so what do we want to do with missing values? Well, we just want complete observations, meaning without any missing values. So we did use equals complete observations. Let's go ahead and run that. Then yeah, we get what it is we're looking for. Great. So this bit of code works. Why don't we go back to our R Markdown document, and we can say the correlation between infant mortality and GDP per capita is, remember, here's our inline code. We can just paste our code in there. Instead of saying, for example, doing that, copying it, pasting it like that, right? The downside of doing it like this is if any of my data changes, or if I find that I made a mistake up here, I have to go through and run all of these everywhere, any place that I might have manually done that, right? This way, if I make a change here and I unscale it, no problem. I don't have to change any of this stuff, right? So let's knit this and see what we get. So make sure that code is working. And it is. Correlation between infant mortality and GDP per capita is negative 0.78. Why don't we editorialize? This is a strong correlation. To calculate it, I first took the log base 10 of GDP per capita, and then entered and standardized both GDP per capita and infant mortality. All right, let's go ahead and knit that again. And while it's knitting, it's something to kind of keep in mind. In general, that's kind of how I want you to approach, yep, knitted with. That's kind of how I want you to approach your final paper. That's what I want you to do. I would like you to do some basic calculations. Tell me the things, right? Summarize it for me, and then tell me what you did to get there. What steps did you take, right? You could have just have easily put this in like a numbered list, an ordered list, for example. That would have been just as well too, but this is totally fine as well. Okay. Maybe I'm done with correlation though, right? Okay, we're done with correlation, and now I want to see the effect, or rather, the association of many different variables. It seems like I need a linear model to accomplish that. Linear models like we covered in our lecture. So the function for, let's go ahead and take a look at our data again and see what we've got. Okay, we've got our nice centered and standardized variables. We have our variables that have been made into binary variables. And so what I want to do is I want to know what the effect, or I'm sorry, what the association is between each of these variables on infant mortality. We're interested in one outcome and multiple predictors of that outcome. So the function to compute the linear model is LM. And then we're going to say, what's the outcome? Infant mortality. Okay. Tilde. And what are its predictors? Well, probably access to electricity. Probably also female representation in parliament. You can imagine parliaments with higher female representation, policies that promote the welfare of mother and child come up on the policy docket more often, for example. That might be a good theoretical avenue to explore. Probably also GDP per capita for the reasons explored in the lecture, and probably incidence of malaria, right? Okay, so I think these four things probably, have some association with infant mortality. And then I need to tell it, okay, well, look for these variables in data. Okay, so I can run that, but the output isn't very intuitive. And so what I need to do is I need to summarize that. And here it gives me the output that we were looking at in our lecture, right? Okay, so we know that this works quite well. We know that this LM works well. So I want this in my R Markdown document, but not inline. I want it as a chunk. So let's go ahead and change echo to false up here. And why don't I do that? But instead of summary, I want some library. Well, actually, why don't we just see what this looks like just this way, right? Let me take a look. Is it going to be a nice chart? Is it going to be an ugly? It's going to be pretty ugly, right? That ain't nice to look at. I need something that's a little nicer to look at. So maybe doing the summary. Whoops. Maybe doing the summary command will make a nicer table. Let's see if that is more pleasant to look at. It is not. It is not more pleasant to look at. My eyes do not thank me for this experience. What I need is some sort of command that will turn this table into something that is appropriate for an HTML output. And luckily, I know just the package, which is called Stargazer. So I'm going to call Stargazer, and all I'm going to do is, instead of summary, I'm going to say Stargazer. And why don't we take a look at the documentation for Stargazer and see what we get. Well, right off the bat, I can tell you I'm not using LaTeX. So why don't we scroll down to type and see if they have something that's a little more... Ooh, here we go. In fact, I am using HTML. Wow. What are the odds of finding that? HTML. I definitely didn't struggle with this before the lab for a full 20 minutes. So let's go ahead and do that and see if it produces a nicer table. It does not produce a nicer table. What might be going on here? Okie doke. So after doing a little bit of Googling, see, I told you I also need to do Googling from time to time, I found that this was the chunk command that I was doing incorrectly. So it should be results equals as is. So why don't I run that again and see, hopefully, if my table works properly. And there we go. That's much, much nicer. That's a much nicer table. And let's put that figure in the center of my whatchamacallit, and then we'll go from there. We'll spend a quick minute interpreting our results. All right, well, it doesn't want to be in the middle, but I don't want to spend any more time on it, right? So this is telling us a few things. First off, our dependent variable is infant mortality. Yes, that is correct. And then kind of our predictors were access to electricity, female representation, GDP per capita, malaria, and then our constant, which is known as our intercept. And we can interpret our intercept as what is the average value of infant mortality after it's been centered and scaled when electricity, when that variable is at 0, meaning full access to electricity, remember? When we have the mean amount of female representation in parliament, when you have the mean amount of GDP per capita on a log base 10 scale, when you have no cases of malaria, because most countries have no cases of malaria, and that's it, right? That's describing that country. So that's why we did the 0-1 recoding the way that we did. So we fit our linear model, we summarized it, and we printed it out to our markdown. Why don't we comment on this a little bit, right? So we can say that GDP per capita still heavily associated, as is malaria, and female representation seems to reduce, right? So why don't we say this? I fit a linear model that predicts infant mortality as a function of access to electricity, female representation in parliament, GDP per capita, and incidence of malaria. I found that higher female representation in parliament is associated with lower rates of infant mortality. Great. Let's go ahead and run that, right? So this way, what we're writing, that's a typo. That way, what we're writing, they can read what we're saying, and then they can see the output, right? That's basically all we're looking for. Okie doke. So let's close that. And I am very prone to typos, so I want to close all those errors. Alrighty, so we've done linear models and we've done correlation. Why don't we move on to interactive charts? Let's get back to kind of some of the stuff we're a little bit more familiar with that we've been doing for something like 6 modules in a row now. And why don't we do some visualization? Why don't I start by just doing the good old-fashioned bar chart? That's all I really care about right now, right? So let's look at, on the x-axis, GDP per capita, and on the y-axis, infant mortality. And I just want a geom point, right? Okay, yeah. That's what I'm looking at, right? That's just my good old-fashioned scatter plot. You know, it's good enough, but it's kind of boring. Why don't we size up those dots a little bit? Make them a little bit bolder so that they're easier to hover over. Okay, well, you know, that's nice, but I want to do something a little bit more than that. Maybe when I hover over these, the rest of the dots can kind of fade out. And instead, when I hover over them, I want me to tell it the country that I'm hovering over, right? So why don't we try and do that? So to do that, first I need to assign this chart to its own object. So I'm going to call that object G. And I also know that I need a special package called ggiraf. Or we'll just call it giraffe for now. Error in library, there is no package. Well, of course, because I didn't download it yet. So install packages ggiraf. That'll take a little bit of time. Not that much time, I guess. And then we can load it, right? So when I use ggiraf, I need to do a few things. I need to use a special geom that is interactive. And the only difference between my regular geom point and my interactive geom point is essentially nothing, except that it has the word interactive after it, right? Okay, so I can do things this way, and I can save my I can save my ggplot object, and if I print it out, nothing has really changed because I haven't really told it what to do with that interactive plot, right? So what I really need to do is I need to give it a few more aesthetics. So I need to give it a data ID, which is to say, what things should I apply this interactive element to when you, for example, hover over a dot? For example, imagine that we're working with our old continent countries dataset. Maybe when you hover over a dot, I want all dots of the same continent to be highlighted. In this case, I don't want that to be the case. I just want the one country to be highlighted. So let's see what the name of that column is. It's just country. So I'm going to say just the country. And I also need to tell it what should the tooltip be. And that tooltip should just be also the country. I just want you to tell me what country it is. So let's go ahead and do that. And let's go ahead and then click G and see what we've got. Nothing yet. Nothing yet. That's a little disappointing. But in part, it's because I haven't really told it to understand this object as an interactive object. So let's get rid of all of this for now. For now, we'll get back to it. It's down here, right? So I need to wrap my object in a giraffe command, right? This is basically saying, hey, treat G like an interactive thing. So let's run that and see what we get. Cannot contain a single quote. I guess one of our countries has a single quote, and that's kind of messing it up, right? Well, that's not great. So let's go back to, we know what library to use when we're having trouble with strings. We're going to use the string_r package. And let's read this, make sure it's still working. Yep. So let's say country. Oh, yep. Here we go. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. DPRK, always a troublemaker. So we're going to say country equals string replace all. Actually, I want to get rid of all of these. Anytime you see country, I want you to replace a single quote with nothing, please. Note that since this is an escaped character, I have to put this / in front of it. So let's go ahead and save that to our data object. Let's rerun our chart and let's see if GG object. Yep, no problem. Hey, cool. And look at that. Would you look at that? We have an interactive chart. It's telling me exactly what country I'm looking at. Here's Iran. Why don't we zoom on this so we can see the whole thing? Well, the size isn't really working for me here, right? We need to do some things to tame this size. So we need to add some parameters that change the width and the height. So let's rerun that, see what we get. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Kenya, Bolivia, Jamaica, Belize, Armenia, Denmark, Mozambique, Sao Tome and Principe. All right, cool. You know, some of these things are a little bit ugly. I don't really care for the yellow on hover. And I think I want to make these a little bit bigger. So let's make these really big dots. Yeah, that's much easier. Togo, Zambia, Mauritania, Bhutan, Malaysia, Poland, Latvia. Cool. I think this looks pretty cool, but you know what? I want my tooltip to tell me more than just the country name. I also want it to tell me what the infant mortality rate is, right? But I only have country here right now. Well, when I want to put multiple strings together, I can use the paste command. And so I can say country. I want it to tell me the country. And then I want it to put put a colon. Actually, I want it to skip a line. So we'll have many, many lines. And then I want it to tell me GDP per capita. And then I want it to tell me the value of GDP per capita. So why don't we stop there right now before it gets too cumbersome. And let's put that in there and let's see what happens. Hey, okie doke. I'm pretty happy with that. And so why don't we just extend this and say, okay, start another line and tell me what the infant mortality rate is, comma, infant mortality. Now this is getting a little bit too long, so why don't I, for the sake of my own eyeballs, kind of put this on its own thing. So I can copy this. I can do that. I can run this, and let's run that. And yeah, I like that. I like that quite a lot. Very cool. All right, well, this works. So let's go ahead and just put this in a chunk in our interactive charts. So we can do some of this, and let's knit this. So right now this is still just in R, right? This is only in R. We haven't produced any kind of document that we can share with anybody else. Could not find the function. Well, it's because we don't have ggiref up here, do we? So let's go ahead and put that up there, and let's try knitting this again. Once it's in this HTML report, we can share this with anyone who has access to cannot contain a single quote. That's right, because we didn't put in this bit of code into our munging in R Markdown. Okie doke. Hopefully I have hopefully I have not forgotten anything. I have forgotten something. Oh, stringer. Just a second. So I need to call my stringer library. Yep. So let's go ahead and knit that. And let's see if we got it right this time. Finally, we got it right. Okie doke, right? And now we have our interactive thing. The good thing about this is, unlike doing it just in R, we can share this file with anyone, for example, via an email, right? It's that easy. And I mean, it's nice, but this is exactly the sort of analysis that makes it more accessible to other people. So now we've done our interactive charts. Why don't we go ahead and we can write a little bit about what we see here. Alrighty, so we finally got our thing to knit correctly. We pulled over all of the changes that we made in our script into our R Markdown document. So let's comment on this. What are we seeing? Let's interpret this, right? Let's give this some color, basically, right? Let's interpret what it is we're seeing. So below is a chart that plots GDP per capita on the x-axis after log base 10 transformation centering and standardizing against the infant mortality rate after centering and standardizing. While, as GDP per capita increases, the infant mortality rate decreases, which aligns with the negative correlation we calculated in the earlier section. However, this relationship does not seem perfectly linear, and much of the change happens in the lower end of the GDP per capita distribution. This suggests that small increases in the GDP per capita for very poor countries may be associated with large drops in the infant mortality rate, right? And then I would go and I would find literature. Well, ideally, I'd be speaking to literature that I already found that talks about this, right? So let's go ahead and knit that and see what we got. Okay, yeah, looks good. Cool. Alrighty. And why don't we remove this warning right here? So let's see if we can do that in the global options. Warning equals false. There we go. And maybe I want to add my theme to this again, just like I did last time. It's not very pretty, but yeah, why don't we take some steps to make it look a little bit nicer? So, for example, title equals GDP per capita versus infant mortality. On the x-axis is GDP per capita. On the y-axis is infant mortality. Let's go ahead and knit that, make sure we haven't made any huge mistakes. And then why don't I go back to, oh, whoops, looks like I did make a mistake. Oh, I never closed this quote. Great. So why don't I go back to my lab from last time. Let's see, is it working well? Yep, great, I have my title. Why don't I go back to my last lab and I'll just pick out the whole theme thing right here. I'm just gonna copy paste this like a total thief. And I'm gonna put it in my chunk. I'm gonna say my theme. I'm gonna go down here, I'm gonna say load my data. And I'm gonna go down here and I'm gonna say set global options. And now I'm just gonna do one of these. My theme. I've already told it what my theme is, so we're just gonna go with that. Let's rerun that and see if it looks nice. Yep, looks good. I like it. Actually, you know what? We're not gonna do maps today. If you're interested in using maps in your assignment, you can follow along with the code that I'll have posted for modules 8 or 7, but and you can reach out in office hours and other stuff like that. But really, I think I would prefer that you stay towards doing things like basic visualizations. And, you know, if your visualizations are interactive, that's terrific. But in retrospect, maybe it would be a good idea if we didn't do maps. So sorry to disappoint. We're not going to do maps today. But we did do interactive charts and correlations and linear models. So hopefully you're not too upset about all of that. Again, there is no homework associated with this lab. We're just going over some final tools and some cool stuff you can do with R Markdown, how essentially easy it is to make interactive charts and to fit linear models, how to interpret them, and other things like that. So please continue to work on your final assignments. As always, I say this every single time, if you're running into some difficulty, put it aside for a little bit and come back to it. Fresh eyes really help. Just take your time with it. If that doesn't help, go ask other people in the class and work together to solve your problems with each other. If that doesn't work, look on Google. Someone else has had the same problem that you have, I guarantee you. And someone has been much braver and has asked about that problem on Stack Overflow. If that doesn't work, come to office hours. And finally, please don't hesitate to email me with problems, or the TA, who should be able to help you with our code stuff. At any rate, I'm very much looking forward to your final assignments. So do please spend some time working on your final assignments. Really give it the time that it needs to be robust. Go find literature relevant to your research question. I don't want to read 10 pages of speculation with one scatter plot in there, right? I want you to convince me that some pattern you've found is worth looking at and thinking about. So looking forward to your final presentations. Really pleased with how far you have all come in this class, and if you have any difficulties, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, this is the last that you'll see me in a lab, so have a terrific rest of the class and enjoy the rest of the lectures.